Morning, everyone. We'll start in about 30 seconds or so, just allowing as many of you as possible to join. Thank you. Good morning and welcome everyone to this Morgan Hunt webinar on understanding and embracing diversity at work. We are looking to take a deep dive into what support neurodivergent individuals may require in the workplace. We'll also explore the common myths and misconceptions surrounding neurodivergency, the challenges neurodivergent individuals often face in their professional lives, how employers can provide meaningful and practical support, and tips and advice for neurodivergent individuals in navigating and indeed thriving in the workplace. My name is Claire Canary, and I am a director at Morgan Hunt, and I also lead on HR and employee wellbeing. For those of you not familiar with us, Morgan Hunt is an award-winning national recruitment business with 150 expert recruiters across the UK in Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham, and London. We were established over 30 years ago, and Morgan Hunt provides specialist recruitment services to thousands of organisations across the public and private sector. And we are market-leading recruiters in technology, further education, social care, professional services, and the not-for-profit sectors, to name but a few. This promises to be a really interesting session, and judging by the massive numbers to sign up, it's a topic that clearly resonates with a lot of people. So I'm really delighted to be joined this morning by my two expert guests who bring powerful lived experience to this discussion. First of all, welcome to Sarah Faulstroh, who is an ADHD success coach supporting individuals in one-to-one coaching, as well as working with organisations who wish to support their neurodivergent employees. Sarah was herself late diagnosed with ADHD, and she helps individuals and teams understand what works for them and to find sustainable ways of working. She has over 25 years' experience in leadership development across multiple sectors, including rail, aviation, and automation. And I'm also delighted to welcome Dylan Matheison-Dodd this morning. Dylan is an autism trainer and consultant who has been speaking about his own lived experience with autism for the past decade or so, having started when he was just 15 years of age. Dylan is also currently the co-chairman of the Autism Partnership Board for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So before we start our conversation this morning, just a few pointers on the format of our session. We'll aim to finish up at 10:30 or so, and that will give us about 45 minutes for our general conversation. And I'll aim to leave 10-15 minutes at the end for audience questions. So please, if you have any questions for the panel at any stage, please post those on the YouTube chat. As I say, post those at any stage of our conversation. I will see all your questions and we'll endeavour to answer as many as possible, time allowing. So to kick off our conversation this morning, I'd like to consider some of the general myths and misconceptions, as I've mentioned, that you've both encountered, understanding neurodivergency in the workplace. So firstly, Sarah, if I could ask you, what are some of the common myths or stereotypes surrounding neurodivergency that you've personally encountered?
I think one of them, and I think we'll touch on this later, is a real lack of awareness of what it really is. I think there's still a sense that ADHD is little boys, naughty boys jumping off tables in the classroom, running around, that it's focused on children, and that it's almost the comedy thing of, oh, look, there's a squirrel, forgetfulness, lateness, and a sense, I think, particularly the sort of stereotype in women of being a bit ditzy, being a bit, head in the clouds, daydreaming. And it's so much more than that. There is so much that is internal, that around neurodiversity and divergence. And I think that is a really key, important message from today.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And Dylan, what has been your experience in terms of those misconceptions and stereotypes that you've encountered so far?
Well, I've got a few personal experiences I can go to. I'll always remember there's one time. So I took a gap year after A levels. So I wanted to meet my birth parents, get myself working, and save up to go on holiday on my own. I went to New Zealand. If you've never been to New Zealand, gotta go. It's worth it.
Fabulous.
But I applied for a shop job in a neighbouring village, and because I've been doing talks since the age of 15, I've always had my autism on my CV. I've never shied away from it. And this is just to do some shop work. And when I went to the interview, one of the questions that I got asked at the interview was, "So Dylan, how do you solve the problem that is autism?" Now, here's the thing. I found that really hilarious and I burst out laughing. And I said, right, here's how. Don't see it as a problem. My one rule with them, I said, is if you ever call me on a day I'm not down to work and tell me you need me in 10 minutes, I will tell you to do one. Because you could have called me the night before to plan it. Or if you want to work on a backup schedule or anything like that, I'll happily work with you one. But other than that, we should get on great. And he offered me the job. And it is good on that part. But also, one of the biggest challenges I've seen, this isn't just me, is that particularly when you have autistic adults that are on something like universal credits, you have to have appointments with them work coaches. There's a lot of work coaches out there who seem to have this idea, this bias, that if someone's autistic, they are automatically unemployable. So during the pandemic, when I was coming away from uni, I was trying to get myself into work. It was quite difficult though, because there's things I was doing you couldn't do because of COVID. But I put my CV up, and when I had a meeting with the work coach on the phone, they said I had to take all the autism stuff I do off because it means you're autistic, it makes you unemployable.
Wow, that's frightening.
Well, I kicked off. They got rid of that person. They put in a far more positive person. I was already starting a new role in just a few weeks, so it was already known I was getting somewhere. I just thought that was a really rude thing to say. And of course, if anyone who's trying to claim it, considering they have to do 35 hours a week of job searching, if you imagine you being told, well, you've got to do all this anyway, even though you're unemployable, you understand the frustration that goes towards that. And one of the biggest things is, from something I've learned recently, is there's an organization called the DEA, not the same one as in America. This stands for Disability Employment Advocate. And apparently many of them, they share a floor with work coaches in like job centers and that. But a lot of work coaches don't send details to disability employment advocates. I never knew one existed. I only found out because of my role on the partnership board that they existed. And the group I know who are in the DA have said it's the biggest frustration they have is because, again, they share a floor. They could easily do a bit of work supporting people. If the work coaches think, actually, maybe this person could, with a bit of support, we have someone we know who could help with this.
Yeah, that's crazy. And as you say, said to somebody else, that could absolutely destroy them and put them off completely, which is before they've even started, which seems horrendous that, at this stage that somebody's got that attitude. Thank you, Dylan. And Sarah, in terms of what advice would you give on how individuals can challenge some of these misconceptions? Dylan's kind of obviously given us a few examples there, but how can they challenge them effectively within their own workplaces? Any tactics that you'd suggest? Because, that can be a lot to deal with.
It can, and I'm really glad you asked that because, and we were talking just before we started about how my sort of reaction to some of these questions. You sent it in advance. And I think what's behind this for me is that there is still a very high percentage of neurodivergent people who don't feel safe to disclose at work because of the sort of judgments, the stereotypes that Dylan's just been talking about. So asking to educate others when we're not often in a safe environment, if we're late diagnosed, that's a massive rewriting of our history and coming to terms with what's going on. There are lots of beliefs that typically late diagnosed people hold about themselves. They've tried to mold themselves into neurotypical environments and come up short, being told they have to try harder, just that perhaps they're labeled as lazy or not motivated, when actually internally they're trying incredibly hard. So asking somebody to challenge other people's misconceptions, and let's face it, it's not just at work, there's a load of really shocking reporting in the media at the moment, that's saying, well, oh, maybe it's just a trend, which
Yeah.
is really gaslighting and negating the lived experience and the internal struggles that a lot of people have. So it can feel really heavy to say, well, okay, how do you challenge those misconceptions? If you're untangling a lot of this stuff yourself, then you're probably not ready to do that and be an advocate, not only for yourself, but for other people. So I think the really important message here is that workplaces have a real responsibility. I think in an ideal world, we'd have both going on. We'd have the knowledge in the workplaces. We'd have teams that were aware of differences, that we normalize different behaviors, different communication styles, the fact that some people thrive in a social noisy environment and other people it just scrambles their brain. I think if we start having some of the language, so we talk about executive functions, we have a language around the struggles which externalizes them instead of saying, oh, this person is lazy, they are that, they are this. Those aren't helpful generalizations at all. So I think when we start developing a shared language on the challenges might be around focus, around sensory differences, we can create environments where people are able to thrive.
Yeah, makes sense. Because if the language you're hearing around you is very negative and challenging, then, as you say, if you're trying to grapple with it yourself, then that's really not very encouraging. Thank you, Sarah. And I suppose, Dylan, then from your perspective, Sarah's touched on it, there's a responsibility for employers, there's a responsibility in the workplace for leaders to kind of understand and support. But what can HR and senior leaders do effectively to, I suppose, first of all, challenge misconceptions in their own workplace? And then kind of the second part of that is then set a better example themselves?
Well, the first thing I point out is kind of going to what Sarah said. I want to throw a statistic about what Sarah was talking about being open about a diagnosis. I've made, you'll see in the chat, I've given something called the Buckland Review about autism employment. And only 35% of autistic people that are in employment have chosen to disclose it to their employer. So this means that, more people are scared of disclosing it because, again, of how autism is perceived. So I think that's one of the things is to ask yourself, like, okay, what do we know about autism? I'll always remember the first job I ever got that wasn't autism related. It was just stocking shelves in my local garage. It was in my village. And the lady who offered me the job, she actually spent a bit of time learning about autism first. She was curious. She didn't immediately say no. She went, oh, I don't know much about it. What can I learn? So she went up and researched it. And for example, one of the things that we talk about is reasonable adjustments. So my big one's my headphones. So I said, look, if I don't need to talk to anybody, I'd rather wear my headphones, get on with it, because I can block anybody out trying to distract me, and I'll get on better with the job. And after she gave me a go to work with her, yeah, she realised actually I was doing a lot better with my headphones on. But it was the first thing she did is just take that time to understand what autism is. Instead of just going for what her first thoughts were, she went, ooh, I could do with learning more about it. So that's the first thing that anything in HR can do. Because again, we all recognise that we have unconscious biases, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
And we know they exist. Like anyone who says they don't have them is just lie. But there's a common one in HR called the halo and horns effect. It could be something where everything looks so good about one person, there'd be one trait that stands out, and then again, for example, if it's someone that's punctual, you might have someone who is qualified, is well groomed, is 10 minutes late, and then you have someone who looks a bit scruffy, isn't qualified, but turns up on time. Fortunately, most people would go to the person who turns up on time. There's always going to be one quality that stands out, and I think autism is a big part of that as well. Because again, it depends on how the employer views autism. So that'd be the first thing I'd do on a HR basis is recognize, see what you guys think about autism first, maybe learn a little bit more about it. So just going off your first thought. And yeah, for setting a better example actually could be when we talk about reasonable adjustments, there's a quote when we do the Oliver McGowan training. It says that reasonable adjustments should be anticipatory and needs, not diagnosis-led. So I'll break that down to two parts. The first one being needs, not diagnosis-led. So not every autistic person is the same. Whenever I do any talk about autism, the one thing I say is if you meet one autistic person, congratulations, you've met one autistic person. You know, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. We're affected in very different ways. And including when we talk about sensory processing, some people really struggle with bright lights, but some people might need brighter lights. They really struggle in darkened environments. Again, the diagnosis is the same, but the needs are different. Then when we talk about anticipatory, actually it could be a good idea if you think, okay, what kind of things, if we know some autistic people struggle with this, what could we offer to introduce? So you're thinking about it before they ask, because the biggest frustration, I think, with a lot of autistic people they have is that the onus is always put on them to put everything in place. And actually, it needs to be a combination of both. So the employer is willing to learn a little bit more about it and be like, okay, here's some things we can offer. An autistic person might be like, well, this wouldn't really work with me, but here's something I would suggest would work better with me. And it's even when you're coming up with ideas, it's taking that into consideration. That consideration goes a very long way sometimes. Like it might not be, like the first idea might not be the right one, but it shows you're thinking about it. So I know some autistic people struggle with this. This is something we know we could implement. Would this work for you?
I think what's really important about that as well, and thinking back to my experience of when I was first diagnosed, and there's a lot of focus at the moment about waiting lists. And I think the danger is that if you just go as far as, okay, I'm diagnosed now, great, I'm diagnosed. It explains a lot. But what do I do with it? I was 53 when I was diagnosed, and I had no idea what that meant for me. I went through titration of medication. That helped a little bit, but there was no other support. And my manager knew nothing about it. I had a reason why I was struggling, but it didn't make me meet my targets. It didn't help. And so I just fell back on what I'd always done in the past, which was to try harder. And I think there's a comment coming from the audience from Paul Black mentions that there's a lot of portrayal in the media about and social media about superpowers, and there's also, in certain contexts, neurodivergence is a disability, and it's both. I don't like the term superpower at all. I don't think it's helpful, and I think there's an element of, okay, you're really creative. You ADHD is excellent. It makes me feel like a performing seal, to be honest. Of come on, show us your creativity. Well, that's not going to happen because the minute I'm expected and put under pressure, then I get incredibly stressed. I lose track of all my executive functions, and it gets really difficult. So I think what's really important to understand is, as Dylan was saying, that conversation, that curiosity of HR, of, okay, what does this mean? Let's have a look at the things that you're really good at and do effortlessly, and let's help you work to those. And let's look at the challenges and what, when are these not challenges? ADHD is highly situationally variable, which can be really confusing because one day we're on our A game, the next day we can barely get out of bed. And that, not only for the people around us, but for individuals, can be massively confusing and very frustrating. So I think that shared curiosity is really, really helpful.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And Sarah, from your experience, because you've talked about, being late diagnosed and the fact that you've just probably, been dealing with this, but not even having as you say, a label or a reason as to why you were feeling the way you were. But what are examples of the kind of microaggression or everyday ignorance that, individuals may encounter at work?
Now, I think Dylan's already touched on a similar phrase, but I heard from well-meaning colleagues, well, I think we're all a bit ADHD. And when you've got so far as a diagnosis, and I think almost one of the criteria for being diagnosed ADHD is that fear of, well, maybe I'm not ADHD, maybe I'm just really crap and really stupid. That should probably be in the diagnostic criteria. So then when you have been diagnosed and people are saying, well, I think we're all a bit like that, the invalidation of that is absolutely massive. Dylan.
Yeah.
It's more so a thing that I would say that we're talking on an autism basis. If everyone was on the autism spectrum, we wouldn't have anywhere near as many difficulties in understanding autism because we're all on it somewhere. Particularly the fact we do have these issues means that can't be true. I would say it's more about talking about autistic traits. There are some level of autistic traits I think we all have, and they'll be different depending on the person. As I said, if you've got one autistic person, you've only met one autistic person. And that's definitely one of the things I want to talk about. And also, as you mentioned, with Paul's comment about superpower, that's damaging in its own way, not just because of media reports, but the thing is that we took, when talking about autism, used to have the phrases low and high functioning, right? And a great example, someone talking about how high functioning isn't a great label, was Anne Hegarty. Does anyone remember the governess from The Chase? A few years ago, she went on the show I'm a Celebrity, and she spoke about her autism diagnosis. She explained that actually self-care, even getting to the studio, all those elements of her life she really struggled with. But once she's in the studio, I mean, if you've ever seen The Chase, she's got a fantastic memory. You know, she's a formidable quizzer. And a lot of people, because they would look at her and think she's high functioning, would maybe think, well, she doesn't need any support in the other stuff, because in this moment, which we find stressful, she excels in. Well, we now change what we call a spiky profile. We're talking about areas where we know some autistic people do fantastically well in. Could be, again, almost superpower-like idea. But then there's going to be areas where they really struggle in. Like I said, self-care. It could be lace, it could be doing a food shop. It could be all sorts of little things like that we don't see. And again, employers probably wouldn't see that either. But if you look in, if you look at a place like Silicon Valley, where where some areas will actually, like tech companies, will go out of their way to hire autistic people, and they know if these are areas that this person struggles in, they're willing to like hire cleaners and have people help with that part of that person's living, because they know how valuable that person is to their company. So they don't mind covering the areas where that person needs support, because they can see the value and be like, okay, we know this person struggles in here, so if we want them to be the best at what they can do, we need to take this stress away from them. I'm not saying because every company can offer to have a cleaner for an autistic person, but it's taken that into consideration. Is that even we can have tech companies can see that on a spiky profile basis, but many people don't look at that. They only see the idea of high functioning, or if you look at the idea of low functioning, where they can't do simple day-to-day things, instead of actually looking at it as a combined level. And again, when you also talk about superpowers, you then have people put on a pedestal. And when you sort of look, these people have autism. So of course, I'm going to talk about the phrase Asperger's because it's relevant. We look at someone like Bill Gates or Elon Musk. We hear, well, they have Asperger's and they do absolutely amazing. If you've got the same diagnosis as them, why aren't you like them?
Yeah.
Again, because everyone's affected so differently. And this is why sometimes superpower, I can understand why, particularly when it's more like for children, maybe trying to find out more about autism, seeing it described in a more positive light can be quite embraced, particularly on a younger age. Because you grow up, when you see more about it negative in media, it tends to be, because it's so vast, it's either two extremes. It's either such a fantastic thing or such an awful thing. A lot of autistic people don't like either. They'll just happily be like, oh, I'm autistic. Some people might say, I have autism, but I prefer to say I'm autistic, but not trying to see it as either. And the best we can go about that is people taking the time to research a bit more and realize that actually neither extremes are helpful for people.
Thank you, Dylan.
Sorry,
you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind when you're talking about the variability, Dylan, and the spiky profile is, I think, again, talking to the sort of the late diagnosed experience is a lot of shame around that, of being great at certain things, being a high achiever, doing very well, but not being able to keep the day-to-day, apparently simple things together. And there's a lot of shame around that, and I think a lot of personal judgment. And that can be really, really heavy to carry. So if we're all a bit ADHD, then, you know, we're all leaving the washing in the machine for 3 days and having to wash it 5 times, because something apparently simple can take a massive amount of energy. And as Dylan was saying, if these day-to-day things take a lot of energy, it means then that we're depleted from the other stuff. And we're supposed to be able to do this. So I struggle with the word masking for quite a while, but masking is showing up and pretending that actually we're really good at all this stuff. What's an interesting point, and I won't go into this too much, but I think it's worth touching on, is that after diagnosis, it can be quite common to have what feels like a skills regression. So I could do this before. Why the heck can't I do it now? What's going on? And I think actually it's more of a skills realignment, that we were doing things, but the cost to ourselves of coping was anxiety, was burnout, was extreme stress, was working very long hours. And then when we start adjusting, often subconsciously, to that, then we can't do those things anymore, but our mental health is better. So I am now off my anti-anxiety tablets, but I'm struggling with social situations. I get not overwhelmed, but I have to step away from them earlier than I would in the past.
Yeah.
But actually, mentally, I'm a lot healthier.
Yeah, but you'd have forced yourself to do it in the past.
Yeah, I didn't realize I was doing it because
no, you just thought,
norm. Yeah,
what's wrong with me? Everyone else seems to cope with this.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, yeah. Sorry, Dylan.
Because I realised we haven't got to. There was a comment from Gratitude Belief talking about some of the challenges about neurodiversity.
Yes.
That's one who's not neurodiverse. Not really gone so much into that yet. I think the biggest one that I know I struggled with is taking on so much to the point of burnout. Because especially when, for those of you unfamiliar, the Buckland Review, as I mentioned earlier, is a review about autism employment done last year. And they estimated that just under 30% of autistic people are in any kind of employment, and that includes volunteering, like voluntary. And one of the reasons I know that can be is because sometimes it could be people who are so grateful to be working and they realise that companies are struggling with some areas. They might want to take on so much to help out. Like I know with me, when I was working in care once, I was taking on every time someone was pulling out their reel. I was like, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. And because I wanted to help out, but two, I struggle with something called interoception, which is recognizing what goes on inside my body. That in terms of recognizing I need to eat or drink, if I'm tired, if I'm overheated or not, like all of those things, emotions, pain, I struggle to recognize in my own body. And it could be to the point where I'm not sleeping for several days. I don't feel tired because I don't have a way of telling me I'm tired. I've taken on these extra 14-hour shifts and then I've completely crashed and burned.
Yeah.
And burnout is a very regular problem. Of course, when you burn out, a lot of employers are just like, well, we thought you could handle this. Maybe you can't handle this job.
Yeah.
There's not actually the fact they've tried to put so much in to be helpful. They've just not realized, hang on, where's the level where I need to take a bit of time for myself?
So if an employer knows about you and has taken some time to educate themselves, hopefully they would then maybe start to recognize a bit of a pattern. Maybe your line manager going, hang on, I know with Dylan, he shouldn't be doing these back-to-back shifts. He shouldn't be pushing himself out there. I should have a word, and that's to support you and go, Dylan, are you sure? Maybe you need, maybe just take a break, and helping you recognize it as well. And you've had your diagnosis, so it's not like Sarah who's been masking, but it's similar behavior. Sorry, Sarah, were you? Yeah.
Just one more thing before I pass it back to Sarah. So one of the things that I also put in the chat is there's something called the checklist. There's different examples of reasonable adjustments. The check stands for, so change the second C. It says health, environment, change, knowledge, and communication is the first C. That's it. And one of the ones on there is actually, baby, don't come straight to me first off for extra shifts because I might not recognize what can cause me to burn out.
Yeah. Sarah, were you going to?
Yeah, I think that I really relate to what you're saying there, Dylan. And I think in particular, the desire for newness and interest. So ADHDers have an interest-based motivation system. So it's not about, is it important by somebody else's criteria? Is it new? Is it interesting? Is it exhilarating? So learning can be a huge strength. But one of the criteria for diagnosis is the phrase acts as if driven like a motor. Now, I used to think, and this ties back to stereotypes, that was around movement and physical movement. And I think in adults, it tends more towards the mental, so that always on, always thinking, and always doing. So we try and regulate ourselves and get back to a safe place by doing all the time, because it feels you don't have to think so much, you don't have to stop. It's very common for ADHDers to self-medicate, to have addiction issues, as a way of calming the mental chatter.
Yeah.
So finding ways to pause rather than stop can be really helpful. But I think in the workplace, recognizing that as well, the person who's always volunteering but they're never clearing anything from their desk. So how do you help them and support them? Is it around prioritizing? Is it around really clear? Is it around giving them less, but something where they have more freedom to do it their own way?
Yeah, that resonates. I'm just looking at some of the comments, and there's Lauren is mentioning that they're considering implementing health and well-being passports for colleagues to encourage discussion and understanding. Interested on your thoughts on these.
So, I mean, you have, let's say, passports. Say with health and wellbeing passports, you have hostel passports, you have communication passports. So I know when I was changing schools, I introduced passport in a leaflet-like style for teachers who would support me, and because they know they'd be working with me directly, you'd be like, okay, here are some of the areas that are struggling. What can we do to go about it? So, for example, in school, one of the areas I really struggled with was fire drills. I used to be more stressed out by a fire drill than an actual fire, because the change of routine felt like was ultimately for no good reason at all. Whereas if the building's on fire, you can easily understand, okay, the building's on fire, I can understand this is going to have a big impact. But then, because he, of course, interrupt the lesson for the drill as well, it's like, well, we just lost half the lesson for this practice. So I'd always be like, if there's a drill, you guys know there's a drill, please let me know ahead of time. So one, I'm not going to have a massive headache from the shrill noise of the alarm. And two, I'm aware there's going to be an interruption to the routine of the lesson.
Yeah, agree. And Dylan, we talked a lot about some of the negative side of things, but just like to touch on a more positive note, really. And what unique strengths? I mean, again, this just sounds like such a silly question, really, because everyone's individual and everyone's different. And I'm aware of not, this sounds like the question is even saying this is a group of people and they will all act the same way. But from your experience, the strengths that you've seen personally as a neurodivergent individual bringing to the workplace that are often overlooked.
Yeah, no, so a great example, when I used to work in recruitment, one of the things I was known for, because I was always busing everywhere, I had all bus times around the county memorized. So if you had a candidate working for a new client, and sometimes they might say that their car's broken down, which you don't know. So they'd be like, okay, what can we do? And my director would say, Dylan, what can he take? And what buses are there? And I'd be like, I'll see what I know. I can know where to look just in case. Okay, if he goes 300 meters down, there's a bus stop there that can take him to 100 meters away from his job. It'll take him about 23 minutes. And we'd let the client know, okay, we've told him this, so we might run a bit late if the car is broken down. We can't help that. But here is something in place so we can show we know what we're doing. We have taken everything into consideration. He knows there is another way to get here. And sometimes where they've still not done it, it just turns out they've actually wanted to go somewhere else. At least the clients would go, okay, these guys really know the area. They know this how to get this person here, just in case that was a problem.
Yeah, you've done everything you could.
Yeah. So my nickname in recruitment was Siri, because apparently a lot of times when there'd be questions, I'd already have the answers ready.
Great.
There's something you always talk about called special interests. Special interests, big term. We talk about something that's. So, for example, for me, if we're going outside of work, Star Wars is something that I love learning everything about. Really enjoyable. Some people, a lot of just people you may have heard, trains can be a great example. You get people do train spotting, that kind of thing. If you can tie a special interest into a job, you're going to get someone who's going to want to go out of their way to learn everything about that job. And then you're going to have someone you can literally turn to, be like, I don't know how to run this. What do you know about it? And if it's enough to turn that, like, can be like a piece of software into an interest, they can tell you everything about it.
Yeah.
We do talk sometimes about like hyper focus in tasks as well. So, like, for example, if you have someone, if you know that, okay, here's the one task I need you to do today. This is the most important one. No matter what anyone else tells you, I need you to do this. Like, don't go that immediately when they walk in. Probably tell them the day before. Look, we've got a few tasks, but this is the one that is the most important one. Can you make sure this is done no matter what happens? You might make sure they focus on that task. That is particularly helpful because I find it easy. I say if I was wearing headphones in the office and I was told to work on that one task, there's no way anyone could distract me if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, sometimes in, like, saying, depending on what office environment you work in, you might get a load of deadlines and you suddenly think, oh, this one's actually more important. And I have seen before where it's happened to me, where I've been told, "Oh, this client needs us to do this now. You got to do this one now," and then suddenly realised I stopped the task I was doing to focus on that one. Well, what do you mean? Why have you stopped when you've told me to do this one now?
Yeah.
Because then you put that priority in place beforehand. This is the most important task, like the day before. With that, they know I can focus on it.
Yes. Yeah. Makes sense. Sarah, I'm just seeing a question come in, which I think might be of interest, and I'd like to ask it because, we've done a whole conversation and webinar around menopause in the workplace. But Catherine Beauchamp has mentioned, who I believe herself got a late ADHD diagnosis like you. Companies need to understand also that women of menopausal age will see a worsening of ADHD symptoms, traits in this period. And this, she's saying, is the only way she kind of obviously got to know that she had ADHD. Does that resonate for you?
It very much does, because hormones play a massive role. So estrogen is linked to executive function and accessibility of it, which is often why in menopause women get more brain fog. It's also in younger women, it may be cyclical. So they may see a worsening of ADHD symptoms at different times of the month as well.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to point out as well is that many of us are in the sandwich generation. So, I was talking to some friends just yesterday of, why does life just seem more complicated? You've probably got elderly parents, school-age children. Neurodiversity is very genetic, so it's unlikely that there's only one person. So you may well have neurodivergent parents with neurodivergent children who are then trying to get help within this complex system. So there's an awful lot coming at you, really.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. Yeah, completely agree. And I think you're right on the kind of younger women as well, from in the sense that brain fog can affect it at all times of your life. Sorry, just aware. Sorry, go on, Sarah.
At some point, it'd be nice to talk a little bit about some of the strengths as well, because I know Dylan talked about some, but I've got some from an ADHD perspective, which
yes, please,
which are really interesting. And I think one of the really one of the things that I just can't not do is curiosity. I've been asking why from a very, very early age, and I think that can be perceived as combative or a little bit seen as challenging authority. And certainly over the years, it hasn't always been welcomed. Whereas when I start asking a lot of questions, it's usually because I'm really interested and I'm making a lot of connections. So there's an interesting thing goes on that internally I'm very quick. I'm making a lot of connections. I hear one thing, 5 come off it. And off each of those 5 things, five other ideas come off it. So really good at systems thinking, seeing effects that might happen and how things hang together. But outwardly, that might look like slow processing, because I might ask somebody to repeat something, or I might lose track of the conversation. Now, it's easy to judge that as thinking that person's not keeping up or they're daydreaming, when internally it's completely different. So that's really interesting to know. Also, working memory. I know somebody's commenting about the executive functions. Working memory for an ADHDer is typically the size of a post-it note. For neurotypical people, it's the size of an A4. Put us under pressure, put some stress on there, load of background noise, I'm hungry, I'm hot, and things just start falling off that post-it note and it shrinks. And then the executive functions all link in together. So it's not, as somebody was saying, neurotypical people can think, well, just focus more, just try harder. It's so much more complex than that. And it's so much more than strategies, because if you don't deal with the dysregulation and calm first, so if you don't notice it and then take the time to just step back and calm, you can't access those executive functions. And telling somebody just to try harder is like saying, just focus harder on the board when you need glasses. And that will be ridiculous. And yet it's exactly what we do to adults and children who are struggling to focus.
And just to add on about that thing with people looks like you're not focusing. If you ever seen someone like stimming or like doodling away when someone's listening, it doesn't mean they're not paying attention. If anything, they are paying attention. If you try and tell them to stop doing that and then focus on you, it's actually more effort stopping themselves from stimming and doing that behavior, which they might not be aware they're doing at the time.
Yeah.
And then because they're putting all that effort and trying to like suppress themselves from doing that, they can't put the full effort into the task you're asking them to do. Because again, you can't put 100% focus on two things.
And I think that where what springs to mind there, Dylan, is the need to be on camera, in a meeting. So I've got to put a game face on. I've got to put effort into, okay, I'm looking smiley, I'm looking engaged here. Actually, I might want to be just looking out the window. I might want to put my feet up on the radiator. I might want to just turn that off so I can listen more effectively. So it's giving those options, because it's very common for people to say, well, your camera needs to be on, you need to be here. Well, I'm putting effort into something instead of what I, focusing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And Dylan, I mean, we've touched a little bit on this already now, on some of what you've just spoken about, but I'm thinking of workplace policies and environments, so how organizations can adapt and accommodate neurodivergent staff in a better way than they do at the moment. So, on that theme, what adaptations should be made within that environment, do you think? There were one or two that you could think of?
Well, there's a few things, for example. So, for example, when we have like information that goes out to people, and in any kind of setting, particularly like healthcare, you have a law called the Accessible Information Standard. Right? So any information is given out is in a way that's accessible for a person. So if someone's dyslexic, for example, we know they really struggle, particularly with lots of like long words. When you get your really formal letters.
Yeah.
If you tell a brief, it's all really long worded and that, a dyslexic person might struggle. You might think, hang on, is there a way we could put this information into a different way? Or another example, if an autistic person is known to take things quite literally, whenever I always think, when talking to an autistic person, one of the questions you should always think is, how can what I'm saying be interpreted? So when we deliver the training, I always remember the story a trainer gave where at an SEN school, a teacher told a 10-year-old autistic boy to go and wash his hands in the toilet. And have a guess what the boy did?
Yeah.
Because it's a valid interpretation of the information given, but it's not the interpretation that the person given the information wanted.
No.
So that is always one of the first things is if you're going to give information, try not to allow for any sort of try and make sure you're trying to get exactly your point across and think before you say it. Is there any different way this can be interpreted that I've not thought about yet?
Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of kind of that, because you've gone through this, Dylan, that switch from education into employment, and what kind of strategies can educators or can even employers maybe learn from educators to collaborate and facilitate that transition a bit more effectively?
It's unfortunate because that one can be quite challenging. Like I say, for me, getting into the work ladder, I had to learn one of the most important adult lessons in life, which is actually it's less about what you know and it's more about who you know. And for getting on that rung, that like getting on the career ladder, as you call it, that was the key lesson to get me doing what I've been doing now any kind of job I've worked before, more often than not, I've gone through it because I know the person. So even if they've done like a small interview, I felt more like because I know the person. Because when we talk about job interviews in general, I know with a lot of roles they have guaranteed interviews. But guaranteed interviews, they're a bit of a mixed bag, aren't they? Because in theory, it's nice. It's allowing the employer to have potentially take some time to think, oh, actually, this person could be good by putting the interview in place. But if the employer already has a negative attitude towards autism, the mind's already been made up. Like, it's, if anything, some just people like, we know they don't want me. This feels more like a waste of time. So I would say for some employers, particularly try and get yourself involved in things like career fairs, because you might actually meet someone who's interested, has an interest in your kind of thing, and you could network from there. And because they've met you, they might feel more comfortable because they've got to know you at something like careers fair, and it already starts that important rung, getting on that first rung of the ladder. That's the most important one I could ever go for, because one of the other big problems is, like, if you look at university, for example, the Buckland Review says that compared to other disabilities in that, autistic people, like I say, far more likely to still not be in work over 18 months after they got their degree compared to any other disability. And I think half the problem is because, again, interviews, when we talk about them, sometimes, depending on what job they are, it's not really relevant. And if it was something for like a tech job, you probably don't really want to see how they interact on that, but you probably want to give them a test instead to test their skills. And again, it's the one question I would have is an interview really going to help to get someone into the kind of job you want? How much are you going to be conducting with them personally compared to just you wanting them to get on with the job? And two, if it is something we want to get to know someone, again, get yourself out to careers fairs, try and scout people, get them interested earlier. I know when you have things like apprenticeships, they can be really helpful, but sometimes the best way to go about it is to get to know people in the schools, to be like, here's something you can do, and build that relationship moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Sarah, just going back to your situation, we've got some questions which I would like to ask, but I'll come to those in a little moment. But I just wanted to cover off, I suppose, that late diagnosis piece. In your experience, how is I think you've mentioned some of the differences, that masking up until you got the diagnosis, and then that the toll, the physical and emotional and mental toll that takes on you. But is there also a kind of potential emotional impact associated with that whole process of you're almost rewriting your own narrative for yourself and also in that professional environment? How did that impact you?
I think there is a lot of emotion that comes with it. People talk about grief, anger. I don't think I felt so much anger, but it was more frustration. But it doesn't come immediately because you've got a lifetime. When you've had over 50 years you don't know anything different. It's just how you are. And I think it takes time to learn about and to unpick and to understand yourself and to really trust your own way of doing things. ADHD brains, and also one thing we haven't mentioned, and I do want to stress it, is neurodivergence is so much more than autism and ADHD. It's I know we talked about this before we started, Claire, but it's acquired differences. It's bipolar, it's dysgraphia, it's dyscalculia, it's a whole range of things. So I know we're focusing primarily, but I didn't want to give the audience the impression that the only neurodivergence is just ADHD and autism. And now what I've done is, because I've gone off track, I've now forgotten the question.
Well, it was about that emotional impact of rewriting your narrative after diagnosis. So you'd obviously lived quite a portion of your life, your working life, and then the toll that takes on you emotionally, I guess.
I think it's the recognition of why there has been anxiety and burnout, and realizing, and it's taken me quite a while to do this, that you really do have to understand how your neurodivergence shows up and start teasing out. I talked before about having the language of, I struggle with these things, rather than it being about me. So I process slowly. I process verbal information slowly because of working memory, because that I've got a lot going on there, not because I am slow. And that's a massive shift. And I think it takes time. It's why I coach people, because having had that coaching and that education myself, I realize just how powerful it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, this is a question I think might be good for you, Sarah, but Dylan, you might have an opinion on this. But given what we've just been talking about, and it's likely related to late diagnosis from the audience, Chris has asked, if someone recognizes they may be neurodivergent, what is the best way to get confirmation? And they're asking, are there accredited organizations that should make this diagnosis, or should it be through a doctor? Sarah, I'll ask you, and then Dylan, you might have an opinion.
I think that's a really complex, there's a lot in there that I would want to talk to the person about in terms of what's the driver of that. I think my own experience is it can be very frustrating that you've almost got to decide yourself, am I autistic, am I ADHD? Which path do I go along? What I would say is educate yourself as much as possible. There's a very good website, Attitude. It's attitude, but with double D rather than the double T. That is hugely useful in terms of recognizing traits. I guess the question is, to what end are you looking for a diagnosis? I think it can be hugely validating for a lot of people. Also with ADHD, it can, if you choose to do that, give you access to medication, which is not a silver bullet, it's part of the overall picture. But I think what's really useful, and what I didn't realise at the time, is looking at the specific struggles that you have, the challenges you have, and the strengths you have, and starting to build up a picture of, and externalize it from, I'm really rubbish at this, to, okay, what am I struggling with? And start to tease it out. And again, the language around executive functioning can be really helpful for that, to start building up a picture of it.
Yeah, great. Anything we reference, we'll share afterwards with everybody. Dylan, I don't know whether you had anything to add to that. I have a question for you.
So weird enough, we're talking about accredited centres. So
yeah.
If we're focusing on autism and ADHD at the moment, that I would say there's two different answers actually for each one. So, for example, I know if it was for an autism diagnosis, there are some private centres where, so if you could be like the Centre of Excellence, I think it's in Cambridge, there's like one where, but you have to be really careful with the private centre, because if it's not recognised as an NHS partner organisation, you cannot be eligible for NHS support.
Right.
Because if it is, you can do. And with ADHD, I think it's even more dangerous about going private, because with ADHD, you're talking about medication. I know the NHS passed a bill, well, not the NHS themselves passed a bill, but the NHS changed things around, I think it was the end of last year. So those that were privately diagnosed with ADHD could no longer have an NHS prescription in some cases, which of course means with some private clinics, they're going to probably want to diagnose people more with ADHD, because if it's medication that they're after, they'd be like, oh yeah, well, you can buy medication off us and keep the money rolling in. And then also actually went to 8 different clinics, and only one of them said that he wasn't ADHD. The others said immediately, like, yep, you've got ADHD, here's things, you're going to have to pay this much for meetings, here's how much you're going to have to pay for your medication. With autism, there's not like an official medication for autism. So if that's your main diagnosis, he's probably like more likely. But again, be careful which organisation you go with. Make sure they're an NHS accredited partner, because otherwise there could be some support in place, but you might need a formal diagnosis for that the NHS does provide. Like, for example, things like reasonable adjustments in certain forums where you could not be allowed because it wasn't recognised by the NHS, the place that you got the diagnosis from. There are some pathways outside of it, employment related, through some charities. Half the problem as well is that waiting lists are so long, and it's a county variant as well. It's so confusing. So I think for ADHD at the moment, where I am, it's a 3-year waiting list for a diagnosis to be seen by the NHS.
It differs massively, and I think I would like to say there that I think it's wrong to give the impression that the NHS is good and private is bad.
That wasn't what I was trying to do.
Yeah, no, I just, just in case there was a danger of that, I think the media had given the impression that, you can go along to a private, to certain private clinics, and they're handing out ADHD medication like sweeties. And yes, there's going to be bad practice, but a private diagnosis is often the only valid route for those who have the privilege and are in a position enough to be able to afford to do that. But it isn't, it's not simple. I'd say if you're looking at diagnosis, do your research, look for rigor, look for recommendations, look for people who are really going to look at your history. Ideally you're looking at primary school reports or experience of when you were much younger. And we're not looking at, well, I'm a bit forgetful and can you give me some stimulants, please? This is something that's touching on more than one area of life, and it's been going on for a long time.
I think for an autism diagnosis, particularly as adult, you have to have that proof going back throughout as far back as possible, even like primary school. Because again, it's a lifelong condition. You've had it from birth. So I completely get where you're coming from. Yeah, sorry if that's how I came across. I'm aware, I do know a few people who've been burnt by several thousands when they've gone to practice because they didn't check if it was an NHS partner.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's worth saying there, and that ties in with that, Dylan, is that the danger then is that you go and spend a lot of money on, well, I think I need an autism diagnosis. I think I need an ADHD one. Well, do you? I don't know. So there is that danger. Ideally, because I think what seems to be becoming increasingly obvious is that although from a diagnostic point of view we have a label on something, actually there is massive overlap in terms of traits and challenges with all of these different things. So often it can be quite difficult to tease out what is actually going on.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's good advice. Sorry, and just aware of the time. I've one final question for you, Dylan, then I was going to just touch on a question if we have time. Given your recruitment experience, and you talked about it, what one piece of advice would you give to neurodivergent individuals who are job hunting, say specifically?
So with job hunting, first thing, try and learn as much about the company as possible. Especially if something's in your interest, because I know a common question is about company interviews would be, well, what do you know about the company? Because I know, for example, when we talk about strength, I would say a strength is bluntness, but a job interview, not always such. I remember applying for one time for a place at college. And it's a college I didn't want to go to, but I found another one I liked, but I made a deal with my aunt that I'd go there. But I actually said at the interview, by the way, I want to make it clear, I don't actually want to come to your college. You're my backup option. But bluntness can be helpful. But I would say if you really want to learn about a company, because I know companies always appreciate if you've actually taken the time to learn who they are.
Yeah.
So that's it. And if you can tell it into your interest. So one questions I'd say is, well, this is where bluntness can work. Isn't so much why do you want to work for them? The question should be, make them ask, why would they want you? And turn it around. Instead of just making it about you wanting to work for them, make it so they want you. And sometimes I think people forget that. That's where one of the problems I think with the interviews are. They come up with some weird questions like, if you were a biscuit, what kind of biscuit would you be? I would say, like, if it is going to be an interview, because I do struggle with interviews myself, do learn what some questions can be. I think in some cases you can ask to have some questions ahead of time.
You can.
And again, this is one of those where I have to always say it depends on the individual, because for me, for stuff like that, I actually don't like to prepare for it. So, for example, when I do any kind of talks like that I feel the less preparation I do, the more comfortable I am. Because I think if I start rehearsing, the one thing I want people to see in me is that they can tell my passion. And I think if you overly rehearse, the passion starts to come away. So particularly when I do like family talks, there's one thing I've now said, like, I don't do any preparation. So when families ask me to talk about certain things, they can tell I'm literally, it's coming through my mind now. I can just talk straight from the heart. And that I know is something as well that can be a very valuable interview trait.
Yeah.
If they can see a passion's there, they'll be like, okay, you might be a bit flustered, because sometimes people do get flustered at interviews. But if you can show it's coming from the heart instead of overly preparing, sometimes you might need to prepare. I get it. It again depends on the individual. But if it's a job that you really want, get yourself, learn as much as you can about the company offering it. Try and see if they do anything about reasonable adjustments, because I think one of the problems that I have is, so some companies have this disability confidence scheme. And in theory, great idea. However, I do know some companies are doing the applying thing just to make themselves look better for it, not because they're actually disability confident. So sometimes you might look at a company's like review on something like Glassdoor or on Indeed. That can always be quite good. But try and learn about the history of the company, because I've done that before when I'm working recruitment to try and get them as clients, is learn about the company, because they appreciate, instead of you sending something generic, you make it clear, I'm interested in you. So that was one way to go about it. I know it's quite a more neurotypical response, but it is something where if you can tie into your interest, is definitely important. And I would also say, again, just try and find out if they have had any autistic employees in the past. So sometimes they've done work, like they might have had a blog about it if they've done something for Autism Acceptance Week. So it'd be okay, there is a genuine interest here. That's a really good thing to know. And you will find out by researching this company. Instead of just blindly applying for jobs, actually think, if I could do this, what would make me want to work there?
Yeah. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Sarah. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. There's some really interesting comments coming through. Someone's even talked about the fact that they're finding the working from home, the Zoom Teams culture even more intrusive and difficult. And is there any way of going back? I don't think we can go back, but there's probably ways of dealing with that.
I'd say you can't go back. However, it's one of those, because at the end of the day, I understand wanting to have them on for a bit, because I think most people are comfortable seeing what a person looks like. So at least having your face on there, you might not need it active, because the question I'd always have is what you're going to say going to change without your appearance? As long as you're still able to add to it, it should be the value of your words, not the value of your face being there at the meeting.
And there are different ways of interacting as well. So you can interact through the chat, through emojis, to let people know that you're there.
I think that's the frustration, isn't it? Is to how a company will say, how can we show you're actually still paying attention? But I say, okay, I'll show that we've got a question on the chat.
Well, we really have pretty much gone over time, so we could talk forever, and I think we could. And I haven't asked many of my questions, so I think it's something we could come back to. So I just want to thank everyone who's taken time out of the day to join us this morning. I hope you found this as interesting and insightful as I did, because it was. And a very big thank you to my two wonderful guests. Thank you to Sarah, and thank you to Dylan for sharing your experiences and your expertise so generously with us today. Just a final reminder, we'll share the recording of this session within the next 24 hours, plus contact details for Sarah and Dylan, and any resources we've mentioned. We'll try and share as many of those as possible, because I'm aware that we haven't answered everyone's questions. So thank you, Sarah and Dylan, and thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye.
Yeah,